Hey everyone, my name is Ashtongleckman and welcome to the Season 2 finale of Behind the Score for Hans Zimmer's Inception. So before we begin, I just want to go ahead and thank you guys for watching Season 2. It's been a really great ride. I feel like it was just yesterday when we got started with Episode 1, Transformers. There will be plenty more to come in Season 3, and in the interim between 2 and 3, there will be various highlights posted from this past season. In today's episode, we're going to be checking out Hans Zimmer's Inception, and I've picked 5 different cues from the film: the introduction, or the logos, Dreams Collapsing, One Simple Idea, Mombasa, and then the finale of the film, Time. So we're going to be looking through all those cues, the harmony, the orchestration, how everything was built from the ground up. And if you guys want to follow along with today's episode, there's a free download to the session, the stems, the MIDI file. That is all down below in the pinned comment. And if you guys, as usual, have any questions, please do put those down below, and I will definitely get back to you on those. But without further ado, welcome. I hope that you guys enjoy, and here's the suite. So Inception follows a character by the name of Dom, played by Leonardo DiCaprio, and Arthur, played by Joseph Gordon-Levitt, who perform a kind of corporate espionage, utilizing military technology to break into people's subconscious and extract valuable information. One of their most recent targets, Saito, gives them an opportunity for one final job that will clear Cobb's false murder charge and allow him to finally return home to his children. So Cobb assembles a team made up of an identity forger, a chemist who's able to develop a sedative that allows them to go into a dream within a dream, and also an architect named Ariadne. So they have to navigate the dangerous world of dreams and the subconscious to plant an idea in a man named Robert Fisher's mind, and they realize that failing the mission doesn't simply mean waking up anymore. Because of the level of sedative, they would simply fall into limbo and perish away. So although the film incorporates lots of gigantic action set pieces and heavy-weighted concepts, it's really the human element that makes it as brilliant as it is. Dom facing the guilt about his wife's death, and him doing all that he can to finally return home to his children. It's these emotional aspects that really make you care for the characters and what they're doing. And from a musical standpoint, there's a pretty wide variety of musical styles within the movie. There's the sort of film noir style during the more slower sections. You have a lot of sort of synthy elements, but then you also have a lot of huge brass orchestration and gigantically loud and rising pieces. And then you also have that emotional heart of the score, which is really captured in probably one of the most well-known pieces from the past decade, and that is Time. So let's chat about one of my personal favorite aspects in the whole entire score, and I think this is certainly one of the coolest auditory illusions used in film. And what they ended up doing is they took this piece, and usually in the film it'll usually be presented in this way. But they took that piece of music, which is used during the kick sequences when you bring people out of the dream world, and they slowed it down around 70%. And you end up getting the main brass motif of the film. And the thing that's so cool about this is it's actually portraying this interesting differentiation of time between the real world and the dream world. So in the film, they talk about how in the dream world, time is slowed down. Like 5 minutes in our world is an hour in the dream. And that is what I love about this, is it's actually using this piece of music, slowing it down, and actually presenting in a very sort of visceral way the storyline in an auditory sort of fashion. But it's something that not a lot of people will think of, and it's something that makes a dramatic effect on the way that we perceive the film and the way for which it immerses us into the world of the film. And that's what I love so much about it. And actually, most of the stuff in the score is centered around this piece. So, like, most of the music is either multiplications or subdivisions of the original tempo of this piece of music. And that's what I think is so cool about it. But anyways, that's just a little bit about the use of this Edith Piaf song within the score. So one thing that's very prominently used in this film that I'm sure many of you are probably familiar with is these heavy-weighted brass hits. And this is something that Hans has talked about quite a bit. But within the film, they're actually a very prominent storytelling tactic to describe the various layers of the dream world and time and everything like that. And it has a prominence within the story and in the script. And it's been taken sort of out of context ever since it came out in 2010 and used in pretty much every trailer you can imagine.
I'd like to welcome you all to the Rimpak International Naval War Games.
And if you look at any sort of sound design sample library, you'll probably find a section called Brahms. Directly referring to this score and to what he did in this soundtrack. And usually those are going to be synth based, but the sound in this score is actually built pretty prominently from natural resources. So the bass trombones, French horns, tubas, everything like that. It's a very natural bass sound with some sort of synth below, also a little bit of contrabassoon / bassoon. But yeah, so it's a very prominent aspect in the score, and it's there for a reason, and it's definitely a main figure point within the script as well.
You know that hideous Brahms sound we made in
Inception,
right?
yeah.
Okay, it was a story point in the script. It's all about what happens if you slow time down. So it's a story point, but then it ended up in all these people's trailers. Where it's not a story point. It's just they like being able to use it to cut from one non sequitur to the other.
So another thing that I found very interesting is it has somewhat of a noir-like quality during some of the slower sections. They use these long suspended chords, subtle pitch wobbles to add to the sonic interest, and other rather fragile / ominous elements to add to the dreamlike quality of the film. So similarly to Hans and Chris's work on The Dark Knight, it combines acoustic and synthetic elements, but it sort of takes it a step further. I think the thing that was so great about The Dark Knight is the way that it sort of combined these two elements, and at some points you didn't even know what was synth and what was real orchestral. And with this score, it obviously has some of that as well, but it sort of takes it a step further, and the synth at some points is able to sort of stick its head out of the water a little bit more and be more prominent. So like I said, you have a lot of these sort of really ominous, interesting pad-like textures, but these really aggressive pulses as well in cues like Mombasa. So it sort of takes that whole concept of combining the artificial and the real to a whole nother level, which is sort of what makes this score a pretty prominent trademark within the hybrid world of film scores. So in terms of instrumentation, the only section where we can totally verify the amount of players that were at the session is the brass, and that was 6 bass trombones, 6 tenor trombones, 6 French horns, and 4 tubas. This was recorded at Air Studios, and the French horns were in the gallery, and the tubas were right in the center, and there were 4 of them, which is a lot of tubas. Usually, we talked about using 2 tubas in The Last Samurai. 4 tubas is pretty strong, and so you're going to get a very, very aggressive, bitey low end. And this, you of course have 6 tenor trombones and 6 bass trombones, which really add to the sort of roughness and grittiness of that lower brass section, which is sort of necessary and needed for that specific effect that we were talking about previously. We could, of course, guess the amount of string players. It's relatively unknown, but approximately, I'm guessing 16 first violins, 14 second violins. This is sort of your normal amount in the violin section. 8 violas, and probably 10 to 12 celli, just based off of the sound and Hans's Divisi techniques, and probably also around 8 double basses, because Hans really likes, as you saw with the tubas, to really get a lot out of the low end of the orchestra. We also have bassoon / contrabassoon. I'm not sure which of the two he used. I used contrabassoon in my mock-up because it has that really gritty brass-like quality to it. I'm not sure if he used anything else in the woodwind section, but based off of what I heard in the score, that is the only woodwind instrument being used. Another thing that we have is a few really, really great soloists. We have Satnam Mgotra, who, of course, toured with Hans, playing a lot of the percussion. We also have Tina Guo, one of Hans's longtime sort of collaborators, playing the solo cello. She also played the Wonder Woman theme on Batman v Superman and Wonder Woman. And then we also have Johnny Marr, who played all the guitar lines in this score, and he also collaborated with Hans on The Amazing Spider-Man 2. Apart from that, we of course also have the brilliance of Howard Scarr and Mel Wesson, creating a lot of the synth patches and a lot of the sort of ambient design for the soundtrack. So for the team, we have Lauren Balfe as the main additional music composer and co-producer. We have Johnny Marr, guitarist. We have Mel Wesson as the ambient music designer. And then, of course, Howard Scarr, the synth programmer, who you might know from the Yuhi Dark Zebra. He created a lot of those patches, and all of them are longtime collaborators with Hans, and they definitely add their own sort of flair to the score. So many of you may be familiar with the concept of suites, and suites are pretty much when you will write a piece of music away from the film without any sort of visual media, just based off of the screenplay or a conversation with the director or the producer. And suites may be 5 minutes long, they may be 25 minutes long, or in the case of Junkie XL, for example, on his most recent film, Tomb Raider, 40 minutes long. So, a suite like that, that's 40 minutes long, is going to include most of the musical content for the film in terms of the thematic elements, the overall textural feel, and the overall sort of vibe of the whole entire score as a whole. but a lot of scores will, have these sort of smaller suites for specific themes and specific characters. In this case, that would be around 4-5 suites in this film. The main ones are the Time Suite, Mombasa, Kick It Suite, and then the Riff Suite. And each of them sort of are called different things on the soundtrack. For example, the Riff Suite would be called Dream is Collapsing. The Kick It Suite is One Simple Idea. Or the Time Suite is called Time. But anyway, so these things were written before, he even got the picture. All conceptual, all based off the story. And I think that that's a pretty interesting concept, that some of the greatest themes in this film were written without even seeing the picture. So you could tell there was a lot of stuff going on beforehand. But anyways, I want to take a look at all 4 of those different themes. And so let's go ahead and start out with the Time Suite. So that's, of course, used all throughout the film, and there's many different ways that he sort of presents it. But one of my favorite ways is via harmonics in the upper string section. There's something that's super beautiful about this. And there's many different, ways that you can play very soft articulations. You can play, the flautando, which Spitfire famously creates in a lot of their libraries. There is sort of sol ponte at a very small volume that sounds very sort of intimate, but sort of powerful. And then there's col legno trato, all these very sort of soft articulations. But there's something about the harmonics that just have a certain weight to them that I think is very sort of different from a lot of other sort of very soft articulations that sound really great. So here is a little bit how that sounds. So there is that. So the next suite that we have is called the Kick It Suite. And this is this theme. So the next suite that we have is the Mombasa suite, and this has like a very strong sense of momentum. There's a little bit of synth, there's a little bit of orchestra, a lot of percussion, and it has this really, really cool sort of string ostinato. That's used pretty cool because you sort of have the... example of a cue that just builds and builds and builds and builds, adding more sort of elements to it and just getting sort of stronger and stronger each time it repeats, which of course is what time does. And also Dream is Collapsing, which brings us to our next suite, which is the Riff Suite. So the Riff Suite is also known as Dream is Collapsing, and it goes a little bit like this. So the thing that I love about that is that when this comes in, it creates a lot of sort of dissonance between all these different chords that follow and repeat. We start off with G minor, and then we go to a G flat major first inversion. And then after that, we go to E flat major. And then, of course, to B major. And so when we're playing the G minor, we have this sort of minor second thing going on, which is pretty normal. And then when we introduce this G flat major, we sort of have this minor to major thing going on. Which creates some cool tension when you're constantly going between these two different chords that are in different keys. And then we go to E flat major and we have this sort of Lydian thing going on. And then we go to B major and we have this weird sort of seventh thing going on. And you think with a dominant, you're going to be going to the... going to the 1, but actually we're going from the dominant. Which is a little bit of a weird chord resolution if you think about it, but it actually works because of the way that the chords are constantly repeating, and you have this constantly creating this sort of momentum. So that's just a great example of how, even though something might have dissonance in it, like this is a piece of music where if you wrote it, a music theory teacher would be like, that's not going to work, doesn't really work, you know, you go to the dominant, you go to the tonic, you know, it's not going to work. But in this case, it does. And same thing with parallel fifths in the thin red line, or parallel fifths in even time. It works. Anyways, the next theme that we have is used a lot during the more slower moments. It has somewhat of a noir-like quality with these sort of suspended seconds. And these are used a lot during the sort of very grim conversations between Maul and Cobb in the film. It sort of goes like this. So as you can see, a lot of these themes that we just took a look at here were actually drafted before, you know, he even got the picture at all. So this is a very common practice to develop a lot of these themes and a lot of the musical elements before you even start to compose to picture. And in some cases, composers will only find the theme halfway through the project, which is, you know, you have to go back and you have to start adding stuff. I think that happened on The Mummy, the Brian Tyler score. But anyways, so that's just a little bit into the thematic elements. Let's go ahead and get into the suite breakdown. So after recording the whole entire video, I realized a couple sections were completely unusable because of CPU issues. There were clicks and pops in the recording. Therefore, I had to go back and record a couple sections over again, specifically this one and the time cue at the ending of the video. So just so it's not too jarring, just letting you know that in advance. But anyways, let's jump into this first cue, Logos or Half Remembered Dream. So one of the most important aspects of any movie is the beginning of the film, when you're introducing the audience to the world of the movie. And I think that the beginning of this film is really cool because you sort of pick up right at the beginning 2 layers into the dream world. And you're in Saito's dream, and before, you know, the movie even starts, you're sort of notified of the fact that you're within this dream world due to these huge brass hits, which, like we were talking about previously, from a storytelling perspective, signify the slowness of time. So it directly correlates with what you're seeing on screen at this specific point. So let's just take a listen to what we have going on here, and then we'll dive into what we have specifically going on during these big brass hits, because it took me quite a while to figure out how the heck to do it. It took me a couple weeks, a few different attempts, but I finally got down this configuration, and we're going to go through it and take a look at how that's all laid out. But anyways, here it is. Alrighty, so there is that section. So let's take a look at what we have going on in the beginning. So we have these super ambient pianos. And this is actually a combination of a few different things. So we have this more natural piano, which sounds a little bit like this on its own. And then we have that doubled with a synthetic piano from Omnisphere called the Ambient Space Piano. And it just adds a little bit of character or warmth to the overall sound. And then we have this thing called the sad piano. And this is just sort of a longer sustained piano sound. Then we have the ash piano, which is this sort of pulsating, I guess, sort of piano. So that's what we have going on there. And then for the synths, we have a few different cool emulations of sort of wind. Again, sort of creating that dreamlike quality. And then we also have this low pad from Omnisphere that comes in. Again, it just really creates that sound environment. And then, of course, we have just these hits, which really add a lot of weight to everything. So let's take a look at what we have going on, starting on bar 10. So first things first, we have contrabassoons all the way at the bottom, just really adding a lot of intensity. And then in terms of the brass, we have this monster brass patch from Cinesamples, this 12 horn patch. And what I've done with this one is I have dropped it an octave, actually, in Contact. And it creates a really, really cool, indescribable sound. It's not exactly a trombone, but it's not exactly a French horn. I think it worked pretty well contextually with everything else, because we do have some more, of course, natural horn sounds down here and also here. So I thought it would be just a cool little addition to add something interesting to the mix contextually. And then we have some mute brass. We have this patch, which is from East West. I don't use tons of East West because I just don't really like the play engine. But it's this really sort of, I guess, dull sound on its own. So if I just remove all these plugins and just play it on its own, this is what it sounds like. And then if I add stuff to it, it begins to sound like a sort of like a boat horn or something, which adds a really cool sense of grit to the rest of the mix. Then we have these bass trombones. And everything, by the way, the modulation is completely up, and we're using expression as our form of volume because we want the most impact out of these sort of brass hits. And so we want, the modulation controls the timbre of the brass instrument. So when the modulation goes all the way down, it's going to sound completely different from when it's all the way up from a sound perspective, not only from a volume perspective. And so we want the punchiest brass that we can get. So we're using the highest modulation setting or the sort of highest dynamic layer. But then we're just controlling that using the expression, if that makes any sense. So got the bass trombones. Now we have French horns. And I just really love the French horns from Metropolis Arc 1. Then we have the Chimbassi. I think I pronounced that right. I'm not completely sure. And then we have these aggressive horns. And then the tubas, which is actually the 3 tubas patch from Metropolis Arc 1. And, of course, they recorded 4 tubas in the score. But I guess this gets us pretty close to the sound, which is a pretty aggressive, bitey low end. So that's what we're using there. And this is all being doubled by these drum hits. We have timpani hits, booms from Hans Zimmer Percussion, and low booms from Metropolis Arc 2. So you get the 3 different sonic sounds that sort of mix together to create a pretty heavy-hitting weight to the brass. Then just a couple other things in our synth section. First thing is the sub bass, which sounds sort of funny on its own, but then when you add it to the mix, it does add a lot to the lower end just to really beefing it up. Then we have these brass Brahms, and this is pretty much from this library, I think, called Mega Horns, and this is actually totally synth. And so we've just taken this, we've done a little bit of automation, same thing for the sub bass as well, and just really doubled it under the brass. Again, a little bit more of a dirty tone to it, which works quite well. And then we have the actual track slowed down, again, 70%. So we've put that in here. And then again, we have the same thing, but just regular octave. And let's see what plugins we have on these. So we just have a couple EQs, again, just to knock off the high end. I think it's the second one. Yeah, here it is. Because if you were to bring this high end back, you'd get all that trumpety style sounds, which we don't really want. We want to keep it nice and low end. So we've just used a EQ to shape that. And then going into this next little section here, pretty much all these wind sounds continue to play. And then we just have the time theme being played on the strings now versus the beginning, which were being played on the piano. And it creates a very eerie, again, dreamlike quality. And again, we have sort of like a subtle dynamic increase leading into the next cue, Dream is Collapsing. So now we are on Dream is Collapsing. So Dream is Collapsing is a cue that plays during the first scene of the film when pretty much, touche, the dream is collapsing. They go into Saito's dream, and they're in a dream within a dream. So as the scene plays along, they have to sort of get taken out of both layers of the dream world. And so the music has tons of weight to it. As we were talking about, those brass hits signify one's immersion within the dream world, and therefore they're in 2 layers of the dream world. So there's just a gigantic, humongous brass, and the music has tons of weight to it to sort of replicate the energy of what's happening on screen. So we start out with this guitar riff. And we actually have 2 different guitars. We have one guitar, which is a much more subdued classic electric guitar with a little bit of crunch, and then we have a more distorted guitar. And then in terms of the chords, we talked a little bit about this, but we have G minor, G flat major with first inversion, E flat major second inversion. So it wouldn't sound as good if we use, for example, the first inversion of that G flat major. It would sound more like this. Like imagine if we use, I guess, first inversion of all these chords. This is what it would sound like in comparison. It has a different sound, but the way that this is voiced. It has a nice quality to it. So that just repeats throughout the piece, and it increases dynamically. Everything really does throughout, but it's just repeating the exact same chords. And it's being doubled by, of course, the bass to supply the low ends. We have these sub booms on all the chord changes, just like in time and at the beginning. And then we introduce more string legato voices. just to sort of widen it up a little bit. And then, so in regards to our synth, we have this low arp from Hans Zimmer Zebra. And then we have these two patches from Omnisphere. I called this one Synth Brahms, which is actually a patch from the EDM section. Then we have these sort of low string, synth strings from Omnisphere, doubled there. And then we introduce the string shorts, which are pretty prominent, leading into here. So in regards to our string shorts, we're using Hans Zimmer strings, the violin shorts, 60 violins, and then we have Metropolis Arc 2. And Metropolis Arc 2 has a much more intimate sound, where Zimmer strings has a little bit more bite. So we're just doubling those on top of each other. And that leads its way into this section where we introduce a little bit of fluid shorts for the violas and the cellos, and then Metropolis Arc 3 for the high strings, because it has a very aggressive sound, which I find very pleasing. That's this one. And one thing I have done with Metropolis Arc 3 here is I have sort of altered the round robin setup a little bit, because when all 4 round robins were activated, there was a little bit of unpredictability in there, which is fine, but the attacks for some of the notes were off. I think it might have been a little bit on both of these round robin layers, so I just took these both off, and that allowed for me to play with a little bit more. It has a little bit more of a bite on each of the. It's a little bit more tight, I guess is the right word to put it. You can see we're using our violas and our cellos to sort of actually create these short chords. And our cellos are being used to supply that lower voicing as well. So when these short strings come in, they're really digging in and creating a lot of momentum in the piece. So let me just play from that point. Here it is. Now, in terms of brass, so here we introduce the trombones. And I'm using this Symphony Series trombones because Symphony Series for me has the most... it has that silky Zimmer quality to it. And for example, if I were to pull up the horns short, you notice it has that lush Hans Zimmer quality to it. Or it's pretty nice. So that's what we have going on in the brass here. And then we introduce Metropolis Arc 1, which has a much more aggressive sound to it. And here's that, for example. Then we have the third horn for the lower voice. So we have 2 voices up here, and then the third voice being played in the horns A3. And it just creates a little bit of variety and puts less stress on the amount of voices being played in the A9 patch. And then we introduce another French horn from Metropolis Arc 1 for this sort of high end. The sort of high end phrase that the brass is playing there. And then we have tubas being played from Berlin Brass, which is a much more orchestral brass than the Metropolis Arc 1 tuba setup, which is a much more sort of, I guess, epic sound because it's sort of larger than life. But I wanted a little more of a subdued tuba sound because we have so much going on in our strings and in our synths with this low arp, especially supplying a lot of that low end to the mix. And then, of course, we also eventually introduce the sub bass, which comes in right here. So we don't want too much going on down there. So we want to keep it fairly under control. So we have this sort of build up here where we have this huge tempo decrease. So we start off 125, we end up with 65. So that's pretty big for this amount of time. It's a pretty big tempo decrease. And it is sort of trying to create that sense of, you know, the slowness of dreams, right? So if you listen to it, it really has that quality to it. So what we have going on here, so we have the trombones being doubled by the timpani. And those just create a lot of momentum. And as the tempo begins to decrease, it sort of has a certain amount of tension because these notes become more and more separated, which has a really cool effect. You can see I also programmed a little bit of unpredictability with the trombones. I didn't want it to be too dead center because, I don't know, it has too much of a perfect quality when it's perfectly quantized. So we have a little bit of unpredictability in the trombones. The timpani is pretty much dead on the line, but I think it just creates a little bit more of an interesting quality. So this is, of course, when the lower string staccatos come in. And that really supplies a sense of momentum. And I love this short string patch from Metropolis Arc 3 because I think it has a little bit of Colegno in there. And it has a ton of grit to it, which I absolutely love. It's really aggressive, which works really well for the section where the brass is just out of this world intense. So it's pretty much like that until bar 107 when we introduce the higher end of the strings and the higher octave. So you can see our string shorts are really supplying the momentum and the rhythmic quality to this section in specific. So let's take a look at, let's see. So we have our percussion, again, just playing these low booms, for each of the hits. Just giving a little bit more punch. Rip headphone users. Okay, and then over here, like I said, the brass just sort of gets more intense, dynamically speaking, as the strings come in on that higher octave. You can see we're also using this contrabassoon here, which I sort of manipulated and made it sound very non-natural by adding distortion. And the reason I did that is because The contrabassoon already has a very dirty tone to it when it's playing this loud and aggressive. We have it pretty much, we have the modulation up 100%, and we're using expression, again, as our form of volume. So it was already pretty intense, but I just wanted a little bit more out of it. So I just added a bit of distortion, and you can see this is 0.6%. We could go even further, but I felt as though, I don't know, it added something cool and vibey to the mix, and I think it works pretty well contextually. And the brass overall has a very sort of Alan Meyerson-y mix, like a very bright Alan Meyerson-y mix. If you've heard of like Man of Steel, for example, Alan Meyerson tends to really focus on that very kick-ass presence in the brass section, which has a lot of that, a lot of tree mic, but also a lot of that shimmer of the room. And I think that using a few different libraries that have the different aspects about them really helps to encapsulate that sound. So we have the Metropolis Arc 1, which provides a lot of the brightness. And then, of course, we have Symphony Series Brass, which provides a lot of that warmth and ambience. And then we have the 12 horns, which provides a lot of that natural, aggressive brass sound. And when you combine everything together, you end up getting that sound. And then, of course, we're using the tubas again from Metropolis Arc 1. So if you remember, we were using the tubas from Berlin Brass, and then we go to Metropolis Arc 1 because we want to get way more intense, because we don't have this really aggressive synth arp going on anymore. So we can sort of open that up and use it a little bit more in the tubas. And then, of course, we've also doubled it with this synth Brahms that we've been using throughout the piece. And that is pretty much how Dream is Collapsing is laid out. So let's talk about this cue, One Simple Idea, or also known as the Kick It Suite. So we start out with this guitar riff. And that's in A minor. And the synth is supplying a lot of the sort of low-end sort of groove. And that sort of maintains throughout the whole entire piece. We have this little art from Hans Zimmer, Zebra again, and then delay drums, and then wind drums. Let me just solo these out. Delay drums. And what I've done is I've taken a filter, and I would assume I sort of cut off a lot of that top end. And then I've put on an auto pan, so it sort of moves around a little bit. Then we have these wind drums, which is definitely from, HC Zebra. These sort of very ambient. And then we have this detuned synth, which has a very CS80 quality to it. And when you put that with the Zimmer violins, it works quite well, because these sort of minor second thing works really, really well. Which is at a minor sixth in relativity to where we started. And then we introduce on bar 128 our sort of string chords, which start on G minor, and we turn that G minor into an A sus4, and he's done this quite a bit. But it works quite well, and it has a rising feeling because the root is constantly getting higher. So it works pretty well. And we have, of course, the Concert Dinos strings that I use all the time and that I talk so much about. They're definitely my favorite string patch, and I start almost everything that has long, silky strings. I start that off with this patch. And then we have the basses. Supplying, again, the low end to the string section. And this is also being doubled with the Zimmer strings. They have a certain lushness to them that I really like. This, for example. And even though it sounds quiet, it actually really does blend into this quite well. Yeah, so a lot of these sort of quieter elements that people would assume don't really fit in with that Hans Zimmer style. He actually uses that a whole lot from a production standpoint. And that's where that sort of silky string sound comes from. And then we are doubling the main melody with just a cello concertina legato patch from Spitfire Chamber Strings. And then apart from that, guitar continues to repeat the exact same phrase in G minor. The synth pretty much just copies exactly what it was doing from beforehand, but then again modulates to that new key of G minor. But we also add in the sub bass. Now you would notice if I removed the sub bass, it isn't super recognizable, but you could definitely feel this rumbling in the low end, which just really warms up the strings. And you can see we've also automated it to have a much more humanistic quality. That's something that I really like to focus on with the synth section. I like to give them a human element and a form of expression. So that's sort of what I did here with the automation. And what I've done is I've just taken, this, for example, and then this, and then I've just taken that and then I've converted it to audio and then went up to audio, process, and reverse. And that just leads its way directly into Mombasa. It was pretty hard to figure out because in a suite you want things to flow into each other, and it was hard to figure out how I was going to transition from this piece to Mombasa. And it's a very common Harry Gregson Williams thing. He'll usually land on cuts with these piano reverses on a lot of those amazing Tony Scott films like Enemy of the State or Spy Game. But I figured it might be a good idea just to land on this bar using the piano reverses, which seems like a pretty good transition into this next piece, which is totally different from this one. So on Mombasa, we start off with these high-end toms. And then we have these bass drum hits from Damage, which are pretty sort of cool, up front, in your face. It's a very natural sound. And then on bar 125 or 152, we come in with a lot of these synth arps. There's the first one. Then we have the second one, third one, both all low bass. And then we have this vocal arp, which is from Hans Zimmer Zebra, and I've taken that and I've run it through a MIDI insert arpeggiator. And then I've also added in this groove from Omnisphere. And then all that together sounds like this. So then we have this really sort of weird, eerie, industrial sounding pad, which leads our way into bar 164, where we introduce the string ostinato in Mombasa, which goes a little bit like this. Which one is it? So I've added a multiband envelope shaper, and I've done the string pluck setting, which helps to really just sharpen up the attack of these strings. Done it for both of them, and cut out a lot of those lower frequencies and made them a little bit more sharp. And then I've doubled them with synth strings. And this is from a library from Dio, I believe. I forget what it is called. I believe it is. I know it's all right. Symphony, yeah, it's like a emulation of stringed instruments. You could very easily do this in Omnisphere or any synth for that matter, but it just saves a little bit of time. But it's pretty standard. And I have ran that through an auto pan. And then, I don't know if this one here I have any auto pan on this one. Nope, just a little bit of EQ. And then, so that's all that we really have going on for the string ostinato. We have this other synth come in. More of like a clicky type synth. And then we come in again with all of these arps from over here. We have these strings. And then we have, again, the violas and the, actually just the violas continuing that arp. Or the ostinato. And here I have utilized a technique where you pretty much will take the instruments and move the MIDI info just slightly over, and then you'll hard pan them right and left, and it gives a nice wide stereo image, just for comparison. Here's using that technique. And then here is without it. So now, once again, we go in here and just super, super slightly move it over. Then sub bass. And that's all that we really have going on in Mombasa. It's a cue that's very, very focused on the momentum and on the aggressiveness of the synth section. And, you know, as you saw from that little video from the beginning, he probably programmed a lot of this on the synth wall, you know, because it showed him sort of on his modular. And boy, what I would give to just be in the studio for one day, just observing how that sort of went down. Because, I mean, that thing is a monster. And there's so many modular synths in his room. I just give anything to just see how he uses them and utilizes them and uses them in his workflow, and especially how he programmed a lot of the sounds from this score, because a lot of the electronics are super, super cool. So complexity is something that can be looked at from so many different directions. There's complexity in harmony, in orchestration, in counterpoint, and there's also complexity in emotion. And I think that the reason why time is a complex piece of music is because it has the ability to take so few amount of harmonic resources and really affect the viewer emotionally. And it repeats 5 different chords over and over again. It has A minor, E minor, G, D, A minor, C major 7, G, and D. And it repeats that throughout the whole song, and sort of each pass, or each time it repeats it, it introduces new things. So a new string voice, it introduces the brass eventually, and it continues to increase the amount of voices and the amount of instruments playing at once, and overall increasing in volume, but also, again, in instrumentation. And eventually, at bar 305, near the ending of the piece, everything sort of cuts off, and all you have is the piano and the high strings. And then eventually, it's just the solo pianos. So it goes from being super, super quiet to being super, super loud to being super quiet, and then you eventually get to the end. So it's almost like a short journey in a sense. So let's go all the way to the beginning and check out what's going on. So here is what the chords sound like. So as you can see, it's relatively simple, but I think that what that C major 7 adds is something really sort of very sort of warm. So we're taking that and we're doubling it with that synth piano that we used at the beginning, and then we are also doubling that with the Woodchester piano, which is a much more, and it has this sort of light pad underneath it. So that is just sort of fading in. We've automated that to slowly but surely fade in. And so here's that together. And in addition to that, we also have this very, very subtle synth rhythm happening beneath everything, which again is just super, super subtle, but it adds a little bit of movement. So the first pass of the progression just only has these very quiet booms, the synth rhythm, and then the piano. And when we repeat it, we introduce another voice, which is these synth strings, which are doubling with our strings, our real strings. And you can see in the strings there's only one voice. That's being doubled in the cellos here. And here is that. Another thing that we've done here is we've taken this patch. Let's check out where this is from. So this is called the Bane beat 5/4 time from the Dark Zebra. And we've taken that, and it sounds like that on its own, but when you just click it once, you get that sound. And we've put a stereo delay. We put a couple sort of EQs to shape it. Here's what it sounds like on its own. Then so it looks like we're cutting off a whole lot of the high end and really just reserving the middle. And again, that just adds a little bit of movement, a little bit of rhythm. So that's what we have for sort of that pass of the progression. And then we introduce another instance of this sort of hit. You can see it's just sort of subtly repeating it. This is increasing in dynamics. We have that automating. And so it's just adding a little bit more movement over what we had previously. and you can see the booms are just continuing throughout the whole entire piece. But what we've done here is we've added another string voice. So this bottom voice is doubling the bass. This is doubling that high voice. There's just two voices here. And then on bar 240.5, I guess, we introduce more voices here. We bring in this to double our cellos here. So that's something that it does right there. Let me just pull up a piano. So it goes. So you can see that movement in the strings is just, again, supplying a little bit of sonic interest and helping things flow a little better. And then we're doubling the melody now in the violas, again, just to add more dynamic and a little bit more of a heavy sound. And we've also brought in Hans Zimmer strings, the 60 violins patch, which sounds really, really nice and lush. Here's just that on its own with the concertino violins, or concertino strings. It blends in super well. It has a certain lushness, and the way, since they were both recorded at Air, I think I mentioned that earlier, they really blend together so well. And just the sound of having 60 violin players within the same hall just creates this beautiful, beautiful sound that I think works well contextually with a lot of these other strings that are happening at the same time. So the synth is the same, the pianos are the same, pretty much everything is the same, but we've also added in brass. And you can see we have Berlin brass, which is sort of your standard sort of orchestral brass, recorded in their normal seating position. So we have just these chords that are programmed, just simple triad chords that is being supported by the tubas. And then we have this Albion 3 patch, which I think just really has that silky Hans lush sound to it that really blends well with the Berlin brass. It adds a certain, again, a sense of warmth, adds sort of a fuzzy quality. You can see like the Berlin brass on its own sounds good, but it's pretty direct. But the Albion 3 makes it a lot more, I don't know, orchestral, makes it sound a little bit more like it was recorded in a bigger hall. And then we have the Symphony Series brass trombones. You can see I called it Hans Zimmer trombone. So I tend to do this a lot. I call some of my samples, names based off of different composers that it reminds me of. And I don't know what it is about Symphony Series brass that just really reminds me of Hans. But you could see the short articulations are also Hans Zimmer horns, Hans Zimmer bones, short. It just helps me with organization. So this continues, and then we have a euphonium actually come in, which is doubling the melody that we've added with our cellos. And you can see what the brass is really doing in this piece is it's just warming everything up. And then finally, we have the sort of big climax section, and let's just look at the brass for now. But we have these brass shorts that come in. Let's just solo out a brass. And we've doubled the melody with the horns, a 3 patch, so 3 French horns. Really pronounces the melody more, and these brass shorts are doubled with these. So when we get to this last section here with the last horn voice coming in, he's really trying to highlight these second suspensions. So he has this horn line, which, you know, we have a major second. Another major second. And the whole idea of this is, of course, with a lot of those noir-like qualities of the score, we have a lot of this type of stuff, and he's just taking that and using it in this context. And it just adds a little bit of emotional sort of tugging to the overall sound. Next, we have the guitars, which come in here on bar 272. And we have a few different things going on. So we have a more clean guitar with a little bit of crunch. And then we have these sort of guitar strums. And then we have a more distorted guitar, which sounds like this. This next thing is we have this sub bass, which is just lying under the strings. Lying under the strings and the brass. And that is all that we really have for this big section, apart from these percussion hits, which we have this bombo ensemble, which is doubled by the Hans Zimmer low booms. And then finally it reaches its conclusion right at bar 305, where it cuts pretty much everything off other than these hits, high strings, and then the piano. So the ending of Inception leaves a question. The question is, has he finally gotten back to reality? Because he told himself that he would never look at his children's faces unless he was in the real world, so that he had always something tugging him home. Or has he accepted the fact that the dream has become his reality? And I think that what Christopher was trying to go for is he has gotten home and the story sort of has concluded, but at the same time, we don't totally know that because the totem keeps spinning. So is he in the dream world? Is he in reality? Does it really matter? These are all questions that are being asked at the end here, and the music ends on this D major with this piano reverse, which really leaves that question completely open to your individual interpretation. So let's run through what samples I'm using in the suite. So for the contrabassoon, that's Metropolis Arc 1. For the sort of center of the orchestral brass during time, we have Berlin brass. Then we have a little bit of Cinebrass, the 12-horn ensemble. We have the Monster brass patch, which is a really, really good one. 12-horn ensemble again with the pitch lowered 1 octave. The Albion 3 brass low. Then we have brass short. And then we have the bones short, which works great for those really low stabby shorts. Then we have the mutes from Berlin Orchestra Inspire, East-West brass, the bass trombones and tuba patch, the Metropolis Arc 1 bass trombones, Metropolis Arc 1 French horns. This is all Metropolis Arc 1 here. Then we have Spitfire, well, not Spitfire, I don't have Spitfire brass, but the Symphony Series brass. I'm not quite sure what this one's from. I would assume it's probably Metropolis Arc 1 again, because it has that rough sound to it. And then we have the tuba from Metropolis Arc 1. So a large majority of the brass here is Metropolis Arc 1 because it has that super intense, really, really kick-ass sound. So then we have Albion 2, Liguriya, and that's just playing the melody for the second half of time, which blends in super, super well. The euphonium does with the cellos. Then in terms of the timpani, we have Spitfire Percussion Redux, same thing with the bass drum as well. And I don't use the bass drum too much, just sort of as a doubling for the timpani in a couple places. And then for the percussion, we have the Hans Zimmer timpani hits from HC Percussion. Then the bombo ensemble, high toms, both from Hans Zimmer Percussion as well. The damaged bass drum in Mombasa. And then we have Hans Zimmer Zebra for the percussion hits, which we've added again, that stereo delay and the EQ. Then we have Easter Island hits from Albion 1. The boomers from Metropolis Arc 2, which is my main sort of boomer for this suite. And then we have the Hans Zimmer Percussion low booms, which is a really, really great natural low-end thud. And then for the strings, we have Berlin Orchestra Inspire for the violin 1 and 2, which I use a little bit in time. Then we have Spitfire chamber strings, legato patches. Then we have a little bit of mural as well, which has a little bit more of a symphonic sound, more of a full rich tone to it. And then we have the sustains from Hans Zimmer strings. We have the 60 violins and the violas. And then we have Spitfire chamber strings concertino patches, which are sort of my favorite go-to patch for long strings. They sound like this. And then we have the basses from Mural, Albion 2 Flautando, which is a really, really nice patch. It sounds like this. It works really great for the high stuff. So next we have the Hans Zimmer violins, and we've gone into the UI and just put the tightness all the way on the highest degree. And we've added a little bit of mid-X. This is like my favorite mic position when it comes to getting the natural body of the instrument. A little bit of close and a little bit of gallery as well, just to really add the sound of the hall. And then we have Metropolis Arc 1, which work really great for like really, really harsh, aggressive, like fluid shorts, which is a really, really great patch when it comes to really agile short articulations. And then we have Metropolis Arc 2 for the high spiccato, which is really great, sort of natural, very intimate sound. Then the Metropolis Arc 3, which has a really, really nice kick-ass sound to it. Metropolis Arc 3 high shorts. Then we have more fluid shorts. And then for the pianos, we have Alicia's keys for the beginning. And then we have the sad piano and ash piano. I believe those are from Project Alpha or Project Bravo. Then we have the ambient space piano, which works really great for doubling with the natural piano. And then when it comes to synths, we have quite a bit. So we have a lot of Omnisphere, you could see. And then we have some Hans Zimmer Zebra, which has some really, really great presets that we've sort of taken and altered a little bit for the purposes of this track. And then we also have that little bit of that 8-Dio Symphony library for the synth staccato articulations that we're doubling the strings. We have a little bit of Albion 3 Iceni for the sub bass, a little bit of that mega horns, but other than that, it's really just Omnisphere and Zebra. So then for the guitars, pretty much everything is Omnisphere. I'm pretty sure actually everything is Omnisphere, other than the Mombasa guitar, where we have the stock patch from Contact. So we've taken that and we've run it through a reverb and an EQ to get rid of some of those dirty frequencies in the center, and it gives you a pretty you could definitely have a better guitar sound, but it's not awful. And then that's really it when it comes to the guitars. And then other than that, that is pretty much it. Then when it comes to plugins, I'm really just using QL spaces as my main orchestral reverb. And then Black Hole Reverb is my sort of effects reverb. So you can see for a lot of these patches, they don't really have reverb at all. And I'm not even sending them to reverb buses. So I really use a lot of the natural orchestral mic positions within these libraries instead of using artificial reverb, because it tends to sound more natural to me. We're using tons of FabFilter EQ just to get out a lot of those dirty frequencies. So we want to keep room for a lot of the brass, for example. So we get rid of a lot of those frequencies in the synths and get rid of a little bit of those mids in the strings as well. And it all depends on what section of the piece you're on. And it'll change the way that the EQs should be functioning. So that's why EQ automation is a really, really helpful tool. And especially this right setting where you can click that button and then change the EQ, and then it will remember it. And then we also have a little bit of this plugin, the Multiband Envelope Shaper. And that is pretty much used just to make those strings a little bit sharper. And then apart from that, we have a little bit of auto pan as well, for example, on these drums, to just give it a little bit more dimension and a little bit more movement around the stereo image. And then looks like we also have a little bit of amp simulator for the guitars, just to give it a little bit more distortion and a little bit more kick. And then for the Edith Piaf song, again, we have gone into the EQ and taken off a lot of the top end, just so we don't get those really sort of very abrupt in-your-face trumpet sounds. And then we've also put those in Black Hole Reverb, which is a super, super heavy reverb. And for our master bus, we just have a limiter and a clariphonic, which is a great plugin where after you've mixed everything, you throw this on, throw the clarity up, and it really just takes care of a whole lot, and it really just brightens everything up and makes it feel alive. And that is pretty much everything having to do with the technical aspect behind the suite. So what do we learn from this? Subtlety. Subtlety is something that is very strong. Just because something is complex doesn't mean it is complex emotionally. And with this score, we see one of the most praised pieces of film music of all time with only 5 chords. But the way that it affects the viewer emotionally is in another dimension, really. And so it's not about the harmony, it's about the emotional effect on the viewer, and most importantly, it's about the one word that we always have to remember when we're talking about film scoring, and that is story. Why are the brass hits there? It's not just there for the hell of being there, it's there for story. So it's a very powerful score in that regard, and it focuses very heavily on these tiny threads that weave through it and really interconnect everything, and the way for which it really complements the story emotionally, and from a storytelling perspective, it's a very, very smart score. And I had a really good time breaking it down. I wasn't expecting it to be this difficult, but at the same time, I think it's good to finish Season 2 off with a challenge. So there is Season 2 of Behind the Score. Again, thank you guys so much for joining me on this journey. It's been pretty wild. It's been fun. It's been a learning experience. There's been some rough points, and we got through it nevertheless, and I learned from it, and I hope that you guys have as well. But anyways, I will be back soon with Season 3, where we'll be focusing more on TV as well. So Game of Thrones, Westworld, things like that. So keep your guys' eyes open. And everything from the season will be in the Season 2 playlist on my YouTube channel if you guys want to go back and rewatch anything. And ever since the Theory of Everything episode, you guys can pick up the project files for all of these Behind the Score suites for free. They're in the pinned comment for most of those videos. But anyways, thank you guys so much again, and I wish you guys the best, and I will see you guys very soon.